Hey folks, Kostya here, and today I'm going to be reviewing my two matches in Chess.com's I'm Not a GM Speed Chess Championship. The first match I played against I am Tanya Sachdev, and the second against Greg Shahade. Of course, I won the first match and then ended up losing the second. And in this video, I figured I would just review my prep, talk about some of the openings that I prepared and was expecting to see during the match, and how those openings and those decisions played out actually during the match, and what kind of changes I had to make during the games. I would say the most important thing that I did leading up to these matches was actually just playing a lot. I played a couple of practice matches, one against Grandmaster Eugene Perelstein, one against my co-pilot on this channel, International Master David Pruis, one against FM Lafang Hua as well, who's a really popular streamer. And these matches were very tough and gave me a sense of what to kind of expect during the actual matches. And one of the things that's really hard during these matches is actually adjusting your openings from game to game, because every game starts immediately right after the previous one. You don't really have a lot of time to think back on previous games and come up with improvements, and you only get a couple of minutes during the break to check stuff. I didn't really take advantage of this. I prefer to just kind of rest between the sessions. And so you really have to make a lot of split-second decisions in terms of the opening and kind of figure out if something is not working, how exactly you're going to switch it up in future games. So let's start with the first match. My general approach to these things and when I'm preparing for opponents is basically just download all of their games and start playing through their most recent ones and just trying to get a feeling for their repertoire, what kind of positions they often choose, what kind of positions they often go into, and maybe even getting a sense of the types of positions my opponents excel or maybe are not so comfortable with. So against Tanya, and actually against Greg too, I'd say both of my opponents had a very fixed repertoire, so it made them at least somewhat predictable, like I knew what to expect. But they both ended up surprising me during the match, and then I had to kind of adjust what I was doing. Against Tanya, since I'm mainly a d4 player, I looked at her repertoire, and she was mostly playing this move order with knight of 6, e6, going for the Nimzo Indian, if knight c3, and if knight f3, for the most part, I was expecting the Queen's Indian. In fact, I don't think I prepared any other move in this position other than b6. And this is one of my main lines. I've played g3 quite a bit here, and if we got this opening, likely we would have seen this position. And I prepared some stuff here, like honestly nothing special. I just looked at the latest games. But I've always felt somewhat comfortable in these positions, so I didn't feel like I had to kind of prep this too deeply. I just felt like if we get this, I kind of know how to play it, and I'll be fine here. And, you know, I mean, most of the score will be decided over the board anyway. And I would think in general, these two matches, neither of them were really decided by the openings. I would say the player that was kind of more comfortable in the time scrambles and made fewer blunders ended up winning in both cases. But actually, during the match, we never saw this position, so I was mainly expecting this. But then in the first game, Tanya played d5 here. And my main move normally would be to play knight to c3, but I didn't really know what to expect because this wasn't part of her repertoire as far as I saw. So I didn't know whether we're going to see Rogozin here, or bishop e7, or even Vienna, or c5. There are actually just a bunch of different options for black, even c6, the Semislav. And I'd be happy to play into any one of these lines, but not really knowing like what I'm getting into here, I decided to rely on an old weapon, and I made the decision to play e3. And before the match, I was kind of thinking I might use this if it made sense. And the basic point behind this system is to just kind of develop in a very straightforward way, like putting the bishop on b2, usually putting the knight on c3 or d2, bringing this bishop out to d3, castling. So a very, very straightforward development scheme. But essentially, White's idea in these types of positions is to just try to get some kind of a fixed structure. So in the first game, for example, we ended up getting a position. Actually, bishop b7 was played. I think knight c3, castles b3, and c5. And we ended up getting this position where black was left with an isolated queen pawn. I should say I actually messed up the move order in a lot of these games. I don't think I played the opening all that accurately, but I had an idea of the type of position that I wanted to get, and this was definitely something that I was would certainly be happy to play almost on any given day. Because I feel like when you get to play against the IQP, it's a very simple approach. You just try to blockade the pawn, in one day, you put as much pressure as you can on it, and you try to win it. Try to trade pieces and try to win the pawn. It's a very, very simple approach, and I think it's up to the side with the IQP that definitely has more to prove in terms of the position. So I ended up winning this first game. I actually think it went my way quite well. But then in the second game, I decided to switch to kind of a backup weapon that I was considering, because I didn't really want to play into this position every single game. I felt like black is pretty solid here, and I'm not going to be able to get an advantage. But instead, I went for another line that I've actually been meaning to try this one out with the Trompowsky here. But playing this one in a very, very specific way, where the intention is not to take on f6 here, but actually to build more of a stonewall setup with knight d2, and then playing like e3 and f4. So playing the Trompowsky move order, but not exactly with the typical idea of wanting to take on f6 in every position. And so even though I won the first game, I actually switched to this for the third game. This is like a backup weapon that I had prepared. And Amon Hamilton, one of the commentators for the match, it was funny. He actually totally called out my strategy. Like he nailed it right. Because he noticed that, the first game went pretty well for me. I ended up winning like a very smooth game. But I didn't want to repeat the same opening because, of course, I felt like my opponent would simply just adjust and get into some other position. And instead, I decided to switch it up. Even though the first game was successful from an opening point of view, I wanted to just kind of keep my opponent guessing and off balance. And I also felt like this system was pretty dangerous for Tanya specifically, because I saw some games where someone played something similar against her, and it felt like she wasn't quite comfortable in those positions. And in blitz, you don't really have a lot of time to adjust. So if you find some position where it doesn't feel like your opponent is that comfortable and doesn't really have a good footing or a lot of experience, then it's something that can be very dangerous, because during the match, it's going to be really difficult for them to adjust. So then the idea was to throw this into the mix, and then later maybe come back to the knight f3 and e3 stuff, which ended up working out quite well, because I played the Trompowsky a couple of games, and then when I switched back to playing like a more d4, c4 setup, and we reached this position again, this was like 30 minutes later, and Tanya had to burn a lot of time just trying to figure out, like, okay, first game didn't go well, how to improve on it, and it wasn't so easy. So she ended up getting perfectly reasonable positions, but she had to spend a lot of time trying to find a good setup out of the opening. And then this was kind of the theme of the first match. I wouldn't necessarily get amazing positions out of the opening each time, but it seemed like I was able to play faster, and then get into the middle game and the end game with a lot of extra time, 1, 2, 3 extra minutes. And then, of course, that's often just brutal in a blitz match. When you have so much extra time, it can be very, very difficult for the opponent to come back. Okay, so going back to the Trompowsky, I was actually really happy with this choice. This line has been on my mind for a little while, because it was actually played against me last year in this just random like G60 online tournament by Grandmaster Bosiocic. And I remember that game because I think I played something like d5, knight d2, I think it was like g6, e3, bishop g7, bishop d3, castles. He played f4. Then I went for some setup with like knight d7. I think knight f3 was played. We essentially got some position like this. Objectively, it should be okay for black, but I actually got in trouble very, very quickly. And that wasn't a blitz game, that was a G60 game. So I had 60 minutes on my clock, and I got in trouble really, really fast. Because if you don't know exactly like what your plan should be here from black's point of view, or you don't know exactly how to achieve the plan, there's a lot of ways to go wrong. And the basic idea of this is that, like, of course, this knight on e5 is very powerful. It's kind of like the Pillsbury attack, where this knight is very difficult to deal with. And then at any moment, if black takes on e5, of course, white is going f takes e5, and then the rook on the f file is going to be really nice for white. So this one is just strategically very difficult for black, and I remember struggling in that game quite a bit. I had like no idea what to do, and I think I was lost after like a couple of moves, basically. So that game really stuck with me. Like, whenever you just get crushed right out of the opening, you always get the sense of like, man, maybe I should play this and, and see how it goes. And yeah, I kind of got the feeling that Tanya wasn't going to be super comfortable against this kind of system either. And then in the match, it ended up working out really well, because this didn't seem like an opening she's really looked at in a while, and she was kind of just trying to rely on her own instincts, find some setup, but I knew exactly what I was doing, every single game. Like knight f3, plant the knight on e5, if c5, you always play c3 here, castle kingside, bring the other knight to f3, and white's setup and approach is very, very straightforward. So I ended up winning, I think it was like 5 games in the match using this kind of setup. I mean, we tried like different move orders, and it's not like I was always winning from the opening, but I always had the initiative in terms of knowing like what my next move is and what my plan is, whereas Tanya had to kind of figure things out from scratch right from the get-go. And again, in Blitz, I think that's like a really good spot to be in. So some people were interested in me doing maybe like a longer video on this. Actually, this setup in my notes, because it's kind of like a Trumpowski Stonewall hybrid. I call it the Trump wall setup, or the Trump wall attack. So if you're interested in me doing kind of like a longer in-depth video about some of the ideas here and how to play this one, let me know in the comments, and I'd be happy to record more of a deep dive video on this setup for you guys. Because now the cat's out of the bag, it's no longer a surprise, so nothing to hide for me anymore. And I actually ended up winning one game against Greg in this opening as well, in our match, the one game that he allowed it. Okay, so as white, I basically switched back and forth between these two systems. I would kind of throw out the Trompowski when I wanted to kind of just play for the initiative right from the get-go. And then when I kind of felt like my opponent was getting the hang of it, I would switch back to d4 and c4, and then we would play one of these positions, which I felt pretty comfortable with for a blitz match. Again, this is all about playing for the right structure. I definitely messed it up many times. I ended up with myself with an isolated pawn, and I had to kind of defend those positions. But yeah, that was kind of my approach from the white side in the first match. Now, as black, I'm basically a King's Indian player, and Tanya is pretty exclusively a d4 player, so I didn't really prepare anything other than just some King's Indian lines. And I believe my opponent's repertoire for the most part was to stick with the same-ish system with f3 and knight g2. And oddly enough, I actually play this with white myself, so it's kind of hard to prepare against your own system. But it seems like Tanya mainly plays this line, and has also been playing the Phi and Keto variation. So I prepared that one as well, although we didn't see it in the match. So I went for a very trendy line against the same-ish, starting with a6. I don't know who exactly came up with this. I think Gristrick started playing this in a bunch of games, and people took notice. But it's actually a very, very dangerous idea, and the point is just to play b5. Immediately or after knight bd7, just as a pawn sacrifice. So if white plays bishop e3 here, black can just play b5. And the main point behind the pawn sacrifice is that if white takes the pawn, black plays c6, white will drop back with the knight, and then black just goes knight d7, e5, and then blasts the center open with d5. And it's a really fun position to play, especially for a blitz game, because black gets really powerful initiative here. And it's also kind of like Benko Gambit style, because we get these like open files on the queen side. And yeah, for someone who's like not exactly super prepared here, doesn't know exactly like how to play, I think it's a really, really tough position for white, because black's counterplay is coming, is just one pawn, and all of a sudden white has to figure out how to develop. And usually when people play the same-ish with f3, I mean, I know this from my own experience, it's like you usually play this one because you're trying to play for the initiative with white. You don't like getting attacked viciously in the King's Indian, so this is actually a setup where white is often playing for the initiative themselves, but here black is able to kind of snag the initiative right from the opening, and white is forced to either accept the pawn or allow black to push b4, which gives black this kind of long-term queenside counterplay. So she played knight g3 in this position, and this kind of makes it more difficult for black to play b5, but the knight actually goes to g3 too early here, and so here black can play h5 and harass the knight with h4. And if white tries bishop g5, which is a typical idea, well, here there's no pin, so black can actually just immediately go knight h7. The bishop has to move, and then black will get h4 anyway, and the knight on g3 is just getting kicked around, so it's not exactly what white wants. So the first game was actually kind of messy. It was like knight g3, h5, bishop e3, kick the knight, knight went back, and then I ended up playing b5 anyway and sacking the pawn like this. I don't think she took it. I think queen d2 was played, and then b4, knight d5. We basically got this. It was, again, very complicated position. I ended up winning, but not really because of the opening. It was just a super messy blitz game. But in the next game, Tanya didn't really want to go into this again. Understandably, you're not familiar with the super sharp pawn sacrifice. Like you don't want to go into that every single position. And then she switched to a different line with bishop e2 and bishop e3. Now this one I didn't really prepare before the match because I just wasn't expecting it. But we ended up playing this variation many times actually. We just we would go back and forth between the Samish and this. And this isn't something I prepared, but as a King's Indian player, I have a lot of experience in these positions. And actually, Tanya won a couple of nice games in this variation. First game here, she played rook e1, which is a move, but then she went for the main line d5, knight g4, bishop g5, f6. Here, I think bishop h4 is the main move, but she chose bishop c1. And then the first two games that we reached this position, I went for c5 here, which is a normal move, just closing the queen side and then preparing to play f5 next. But then in two games, she played knight e1, knight h6, and g4, which I didn't feel like was right. I feel like this isn't the right position to do it in. But both games I ended up getting checkmated brutally. So, you know, it's like during the match, you feel like, you know, something is supposed to be good for you, but you're losing every game. So I decided to kind of switch away from this, even though objectively I feel like, wow, should be good for black, but yeah, somehow it wasn't working. So then the third time we reached this position, I switched over to f5. And objectively, I think this is quite a decent move, but it leads to a completely different position. In this case, white takes on c6, takes on f5, and we get a much more open position. I think I was more successful in this one, although I definitely lost games in this line as well as the match sped up. But in general, I think it was a good switch because in the other line, I was just kind of getting outplayed every game. And once we switched to this position, it suddenly wasn't so easy for white. And that's something I learned that in these matches. It's really important to switch it up very quickly if a line isn't working for you. Yeah, so we basically switched back between this system and the Samish, where I was getting a lot of like very juicy attacking positions. And yeah, in general, I felt like the King's Indian held up fine, you know, for blitz and bullet. It's really difficult for white to kind of take advantage of the space and some of the advantages you typically get in the King's Indian. But probably the biggest success for me in the first match was with white just playing this like Trump Stonewall hybrid attack. I think this one was a pretty decent weapon. Now against Greg, things were also pretty tricky. Greg is also someone with a pretty fixed repertoire. Against like d4 and c4. For the most part, I saw that he was playing the Grunfeld in recent years with some Nimzo and Bogo Indians thrown in. I wasn't sure if I was going to see them during the match. He ended up playing one. But this is, again, a type of opening where I feel like I don't really need to be super prepped here and I can just kind of play by feel. Although this wasn't really right because he did hit me with this line, a3, bishop e7, e4, d5. And this is one where white does have to kind of know a thing or two. And it's been a while since I checked the theory here. So I kind of struggled in this game and then never really wanted to repeat it. But for the most part, Greg is a Grunfeld player. So I mainly focused on the Grunfeld and looking for lines here. Now in the first game that I had white, it actually ended up working out beautifully because the line I prepared was with bishop e3, black played c5 and queen d2. This line that Carlsen was playing a couple of years ago with really good success. And I ended up using a new wrinkle in the theory here. Castles, knight f3, rook d8. This is like the main line of main lines. And here for the most part, almost everyone has been playing d5. But then I saw a number of games where Grandmaster Vidit was playing h4 in this position. And Vidit is one of the big exponents of this bishop e3 Grunfeld. Like, he has a ton of games here, a lot of wins against some really strong players. So I always like to follow his games because I feel like, you know, the guy probably knows what he's doing and is working very hard on his openings. So he played this one a couple of times with good success. And yeah, it actually is a pretty dangerous line, like if black isn't familiar. And in the first game, it seemed like Greg wasn't like too aware of this position because he started spending a little bit time here. So Greg does something that Grunfeld players typically rely on, just go c takes d4, cd4, and queen takes d2, going for this endgame. But I saw that this endgame is actually not so easy for black to equalize. And actually I ended up getting Greg in this trap here. He goes bishop g4, which is like very natural move, hitting the knight on f3. I push d5 to keep the pawn defended. And now Greg played the most natural move in the position, knight d7, which runs into this nice trick, knight h2. And all of a sudden the bishop actually ends up trapped. If bishop h5, there's g4. And if h5, white just goes f3, and the bishop is caught. And I actually had seen this whole thing before, because this happened exactly in one of Vidit's games, which is pretty funny. Unfortunately, I didn't end up winning this game, which was tragic. Like, black played knight f6, I pushed e5, which is the idea, and then after knight e4, which I thought was a really interesting try, knight takes g4, takes, rook takes d5. Even though white won the piece, black did have some kind of nagging pressure here, and I ended up blundering like in 3 moves later. So this was kind of tragic. I was lucky not to lose this game, actually. But yeah, real bummer, because this was basically a free point, like, out of the opening. It's very rare when you're able to just prepare a line and you get a completely winning position out of your prep. So sometimes you're able to get lucky and catch your opponents, you know, in this kind of trap. But yeah, so it's kind of a shame I wasn't able to capitalize it. And of course, that was kind of the story of the match, is getting some really decent positions with both colors, and then slipping up in the critical moment and blundering the win away. So after this game, Greg didn't repeat the Grunfeld for a while. He switched over to the Bogo Indian. But I also wanted to try the Trompowsky against Greg as well, because I noticed that against bishop g5, he was basically playing this line recently with c5, d5, and d6. And I mean, this is a very playable system, but the thing is that this kind of goes into King's Indian type of structure, where black is often playing g6. So there's theory here, like knight c3, black actually will play h6 here, inviting white to take and kind of inviting the structure. And this structure, I would think, is very playable for black. You just go put your bishop on g7, eventually break with f5, and basically everything is fine. But I thought it would actually be interesting to try this idea. So I prepared this move c4. And on h6, the point was to just drop back all the way bishop to c1, and then kind of develop like normal fashion, knight c3, e4, and just pretend like we're playing a King's Indian. The reason I wanted to do this is because Greg is, of course, a Grunfeld player. And in his games, there was basically 0 games that I saw where he plays bishop g7. So just strictly Grunfeld player, not really King's Indian player. Ironically, in the match, actually, he played bishop g7 a couple of times, and I actually don't know whether this was a mistake or not, because the first time he played it, I looked over at the webcam, and he kind of looked like, he had this face like, oh, what did I just do? Almost like he forgot to play d5 and played bishop g7 on autopilot. So we actually played a couple of pure King's Indians, which, I don't know if this was intentional on his end or not. But in general, I don't view him as like a King's Indian player, so my idea was to go for this position where, even though white is actually going to be a tempo down, like we play 2 moves with the bishop out, and so black gets an extra tempo and this move h6 for free, I felt like Greg is not going to be so comfortable in the structure and like not so familiar. So the score, didn't really work out in my favor here, but a lot of the positions I was getting after like g6, knight c3, I think bishop g7, e4, castles, and here, for example, even though black is actually up a tempo compared to the normal lines and is totally fine, it felt like Greg wasn't quite comfortable here, and he kind of switched it up every game. I think most games that we reached some position like this, I was able to get a big advantage, just developing like bishop d3, knight f3, like knight e2. I think I played one game. Not every game. There were a couple of games where I kind of just played badly in the middle of the game. But I felt like this was a decent choice, again, because he's not really much of a King's Indian player, and I felt like I have decent chances here compared to a position where he has a lot of experience and feels super comfortable. So with white, I feel like I ended up doing pretty well as far as the opening is concerned. But again, I had a lot of good positions that I just couldn't convert, couldn't put away, and that kind of ended up deciding the match. I feel like Greg, actually to his credit, just defended very, very well, like always finding like only moves and ways to continue the game, and just not making it easy for me to collect and score points. Now with black against Greg, I had a tough time figuring out what to do because he's pretty much exclusively an e4 player. He's actually very well prepped. In fact, it's a running joke on Twitter that he's like always using Chessable, and he has his repertoire down really well. And indeed, when I see his games, I feel like he is, for the most part, following a lot of good lines and is playing really well in the opening. So I don't really have like such a comfortable weapon against e4. Like against d4, like I'm happy to play the King's Indian literally against anyone. I'll just defend those positions all day long and have fun doing so. But against e4, I don't really have like a similar pet weapon. I've been messing around with like knight c6 for a while, which kind of leads into like King's Indian type positions. And I've also played both e5 and c5 for a while too. So I could play like the Ruy Lopez or some Sicilian like the Taimanov, but it's not something I'm like super passionate about. So for this match, I prepared a couple of different systems. One was the Ruy, which I wanted to have just in case the knight c6 stuff wasn't really working out. And I ended up going with the deferred Steinitz here, just because I feel like sometimes these positions can actually mold into a King's Indian, and I feel kind of comfortable with like g6, bishop g7, and in this kind of play. But also the line that Greg played, I felt like isn't the most critical, and this is the one he ends up going for in the match with d4 here. So takes, b5. Now white has to throw this in. If bishop b3, black takes, and we get the famous Noah's Ark trap, and this is just winning for black. So white does have to take here, take, and bishop b3. And I don't know if this was like a great choice for the match. Like objectively, I think black is equalizing here, but I did kind of suffer in some of the games because white would just get somewhat of just this like pressing advantage. Greg would just play this every game. And this kind of fit his style more than it fit mine, because Greg is a very quick player. He sees a lot of quick tactics, quick tricks very quickly. And especially in the first game, I think he just kind of showed exactly why he's kind of the superior blitz player, is that he was able to just play a little bit faster. And at the end, he was kind of able to trick me in the time scramble and end up winning a game that was basically equal the whole time. So I'm not sure if this was the best strategy to get into these positions where I was kind of like slightly worse and trying to hold without a lot of like active counterplay. I did end up winning, I think, 1 or 2 of these positions, but yeah, for the most part, I was kind of suffering here. My other choice was to play the Nimzovich defense with knight c6. This is one I've been playing for some time now because it's basically a fun system, and a lot of times will get into this kind of King's Indian style position. But I got into trouble with this one early because Greg ended up preparing a line that I just wasn't too familiar with, or at least hadn't checked in a while. When I was preparing for him beforehand, against the Perk with knight c6, basically exclusively he played bishop e2, and actually a very timid setup here with castles, and bishop e3. So I was expecting this position before the match, and I was actually kind of excited to play this because I felt like if I can get this position every game, I felt like black gets excellent play here, and definitely not the most aggressive way for white to play. But then Greg surprised me, so clearly he prepared this. Because he ends up pushing d5, and this is something that was pretty uncharacteristic, like taking the space. This is not something I had seen him do in a lot of games. And he went for this setup, I think h3, bishop c4, castles, c6, a4. There he puts the queen on e2, and then bishop comes out to f4 or g5, rooks come to the center. It's basically like this very simple play. And although I think black has a really playable position here, during the match it felt very passive, and I struggled in both games that we kind of reached this type of position. Like I tried some different stuff here, but Greg was basically just very comfortable. Although one game I had like a completely winning position because Greg blundered a tactic, but the opening did not go my way, so I didn't want to repeat that position. So after these 2 games where I really struggled with this system, I decided to switch back to the Rui. But then I realized, I think a little bit too late, what I should have done. And then later in the match, I finally figured out that I should switch to d6. So I was happy with this transition. I just wish I made it earlier. You know, maybe after the first knight c6 game didn't go my way, I wish I had switched to this move order. Because in the regular perk, basically white has to choose a system here. And Greg, for the most part, according to his repertoire, would play knight f3, bishop g7, bishop e2. And then castles, and here black has a wide choice. You can go c6, a6, knight c6, knight bd7, a lot of different moves. And so here, if I play knight c6 and kind of transpose to the line I'm used to, now because white played bishop e2 super early, he can't really go for this d5. He basically doesn't get the same setup, right? Because his bishop is on e2 instead of c4, and compared to the previous position, black is just up a tempo, and these positions I think are totally fine for black. So the drawback with the typical move order is that like white can play something like f4 or the English attack, which is like more aggressive, but Greg's main approach usually is to go knight f3, bishop e2. So I should have switched to this move order early. I ended up doing it, and I think it was successful. Now, Greg mostly plays knight f3, bishop e2. I also saw some games where he does go for the English attack, but they were pretty rare, and to me it felt like he only does this every once in a while and feels much more comfortable with knight f3, bishop e2, kind of like a simpler position. Because when white goes bishop e3 and goes for these positions with queen d2 and f3, I mean, they're very fun, they're definitely good lines for white, but the positions are like very, very sharp, and for a blitz game, I don't think this is exactly what Greg wants. I think he wants like a simpler position where you can just apply some healthy pressure, make like simple moves, and I don't think he really wanted this like super tactical slugfest with opposite sides castling. But as a King's Indian player, I do want that. So in the first game that I chose, that I played this move order with d6, he ends up going for the English attack, and then I just play knight c6 here because like this is kind of what I'm comfortable with, and he's already not able, you know, to go for the setup that has been so successful so far with d5 and h3. So the first game that we saw this, I think, happened when like this. I played e5, I think d5 was played, which is probably not best, knight e7, g4, h5, g5, knight d7. And this is actually kind of the exact position I was hoping for out of this opening, where it kind of feels like a King's Indian. Greg's more of an e4 player, not really a d4 player, so I feel like this could be successful for me. Objectively, it's certainly risky for black, but the idea is actually now we're just going to castle. The king side is kind of closed. White is probably going to go queen side, and then we're going to get this counterplay with a6, b5. Greg here actually ends up going wrong very quickly. I think he castles a6 and he plays f4 here, which is a pretty serious mistake because this allows black to just open up the diagonal, and then on bishop takes f4, which wasn't played, knight e5, basically all of black's pieces come to life, and I think this is already a good position. In the game, I think bishop d4 was played. We had something like this, but this was already quite problematic for white after like b5 castles, and yeah, I was able to just get this like massive counterattack on the queen side, and it was basically like perfect, you know, Sicilian dragon, where white's kingside attack wasn't really successful. So this ended up being a very successful opening choice, and then in the next game I repeated it. Greg decided to switch back to his usual classical stuff, and then I was able to get my knight c6 lines and avoid kind of this annoying line that he prepped. And then we ended up getting, I think he played h3, e5, and bishop e3, which these positions totally fine for black. Although I ended up losing this game, I mean, it definitely wasn't because of the opening. In fact, I felt like this kind of position, black is already slightly more comfortable because you have all this nice pressure and you have this idea of knight d7 to open up the bishop, and yeah, basically very harmonious setup for black here. So although Greg won this game, he didn't like this either. In the next game, he ends up switching, going back to bishop e3, and then I think he improves on the line e5. He goes knight e2 here, and then I prepared to play this move h5, which is just an annoying move to deal with, especially in a blitz game, because it stops white's main idea of g4. And of course, whenever I castle here, I mean, things are going to be super risky, but In the meantime, if I keep my king in the center, it's like not obvious for white what to do here. And if you don't have a ton of experience in this position, it doesn't really matter if like the engine says it's like +1 or something. It's like very difficult to play accurately for white. So this game I think was also quite successful for me. At some point, I think the game went castles, bishop d7, takes, knight d4, something like this. And again, it was kind of like a Sicilian dragon where I think I got the upper hand. I played quick b5, and I mean, it was a messy game. I think this was actually a bullet game that this happened. A super messy game, but it went my way because I think I was kind of more comfortable with this kind of position. And then after this game, that was like 3 in a row. I got like good perks. Greg switched over, and I think he started playing like b3, g3. Basically, I don't think he played e4 ever again in the match. So it was a very, very good change, but I wish it happened. I wish it happened earlier. So yeah, that pretty much wraps it up. Hope you guys found this video useful. If you did, please leave a like on it and let me know in the comments. Of course, I think the matches were decided by much more than just the opening, but hopefully you guys can see that making considerate opening choices and thinking about the types of positions that you personally want to play and you feel more comfortable in. I think this is one of the most important things when it comes to choosing your openings. It's not about the objective value of a lot of variations. It's about finding positions where you feel comfortable in and changing positions that clearly are not working for you. Overall, it was an amazing experience to play these 2 matches. I mean, they were very stressful, but kind of fun at the same time. And I feel like I improved a lot on my own just by like training a lot, prepping a lot, working hard for these matches. And then almost all the games were, super interesting and worth learning from. Even though they're full of mistakes, full of blunders, of course, there's a lot of interesting ideas and a lot of cool takeaways. All right, guys, gonna wrap it up there. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.